So we'll just kind of pick up right where we left off yesterday, talking about colonialization and specifically kind of the early beginnings of the American colonies, which would then later become the United States. So we're kind of going through very early U.S. history. Today, we're going to talk, again, briefly about the American Revolution. I have this slide up, which is something we talked about yesterday, but I just kind of want to revisit this briefly before we kind of move on to a new topic. So just to kind of recap, the types of people that were coming to the colonies from Great Britain. And again, if we look back here, so just to kind of reiterate what we're talking about, right? So here's the 13 colonies, and this is kind of where they're located geographically. Which again, in this picture would be right here. Here's England way over here. For those of us that aren't geographically inclined, so a long distance between the 13 colonies and England and Great Britain. So again, those people that were making this long voyage across the Atlantic Ocean to live in the New World, essentially what it was, were types of people that were looking for opportunity or certain freedom. We kind of talked about this yesterday. So people looking for land, wealth, new business opportunities, or a new start. People that wanted work. Again, there wasn't lots of land, opportunity, or new jobs in England and Great Britain. People that needed those things or that wanted a new start were inclined to leave. These weren't typically wealthy, upper class people that had great jobs or that were very successful, because those people stayed in England. For people that needed a new start. Okay, we talked about indentured servitude. So people that either came for work that could afford it, came over and earned land and property, but also people that couldn't afford it were essentially paid for by employers. Employers paid people's passage over the Atlantic to the American colonies. And those people essentially had to work off that fee, essentially. So they were working for nothing until X amount of years had passed, and then they were then free. And then we talked about all the people that were seeking religious freedoms, right? So we're not going to run down the list again, but you had people that wanted to practice their own religion free of judgment or persecution from the Church of England or people in England. So that kind of brings us back to where we left off yesterday, the 13 original colonies. Okay? So you can kind of see there on the side some of the colonies were started by various people. Again, all of these colonies were controlled by England and Great Britain. But you had certain colonies like New York, Delaware, and New Jersey, which were predominantly Dutch settlers from the Netherlands, although they were living in a British colony, right? They were essentially Dutch people that lived there. Then you had places like Maryland, which were, Maryland was started as a colony for Catholics, right? So it wasn't exclusively for Catholics, but it was begun as a colony that was going to be sympathetic to Catholic people that were practicing Catholicism. You had Virginia, which was started by a company, right? You had Pennsylvania, started by William Penn and the Quakers, which was another religious group. And let's see, what are some other ones on here that are interesting? Georgia was actually started as a prison colony and served as a buffer from the Spanish, who at the time, the Spanish owned and controlled Florida. Florida was a Spanish colony, so Georgia was founded as a prison colony. And so you have all these kind of interesting stories for how these different colonies started and kind of what was different or unique about it. All right. So the majority of what I want to talk about today is the American Revolution. So some of this stuff is, some of the information on these slides isn't things we need to focus on, so I'm going to run through some of it quickly. So if it feels like I'm glossing over lots of stuff, don't. These are just some of the earliest colonies. You have Roanoke Island down here in present-day North Carolina. 1585, you have Jamestown in Virginia in 1608. And then further to the north, we have Plymouth Rock, 1620. That's the Mayflower and all that good stuff, right? That we talk about on Thanksgiving and all blah, 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 right? You have New Hampshire colony, which is not beyond this map. Further north. You have Rhode Island, and you have Connecticut, right? So some familiar names there, right? But those were some of the earliest colonies that we founded in the New World and in the British 13. So let me move on and talk about the American Revolution. So there's a lot of stuff up here again. I'm gonna go through the stuff that's more important and skip over the stuff that's not. Right? Key here is know who was fighting, right? So it was the American colonists who were rebelling against Great Britain or England, right? And they were rebelling because they no longer wanted to be part of the kingdom of Great Britain, right? They didn't want to be under or subject to the rule of the King of England. They wanted to be independent. So it was a slow and steady lead up to that happening. It wasn't like there was one thing that triggered it and then all of a sudden we revolted as Americans. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of these causes and talk about some of these. So ideas related to a developing sense of independence, that kind of ties into the second, which is time and distance. So again, if we go back to that last slide and we remember some of these early settlements were 1600, right? The American Revolution doesn't happen until 1765. So that's 150 years in between. So what you had generations of people being born in the American colonies. And they didn't know anything about England or Great Britain, and they probably, many of them had never been there or never seen England and never met the king. And so over time, you get more and more people that are born and they don't know anything else other than life in the colonies. And they see England as this far off in the distance place that's essentially controlling them and telling them what they can and can't do. And it's this entity that they've never met before. So that amount of time and the distance, the physical distance between the two places, right? So I don't know off the top of my head, but 4,000-ish miles, right? Point is a long distance, right? So you start to develop, or the American colonists start to develop this sense of independence. Like, why do we need Great Britain? They're 4,000 miles away and we've never seen them before. They just take our money and tell us what we can and can't do. So what the heck good is that, right? So you start to get this growing sense of independence that slowly happens over time, right? And then what really ramps things up is this tension about taxation without representation. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But essentially, Great Britain collecting taxes and the American colonists not seeing any benefit back, right? So ideally, and again, no one loves to pay taxes, but to some point, taxes are essential, right? But when you're an American colonist and you're paying tax money back to England, and then you're not seeing any benefits back, that starts to feel like you're just paying England for nothing, right? And so that's kind of the the tension over taxes is what really leads to kind of a blow up when we talk about the revolt against Britain. Okay, so let's see, making sure we're doing all right with time. So again, these are some of the causes, and I'll talk kind of through them quickly. Salutary neglect, distance and travel time between Britain and her colonies led to neglect. So that's, again, going back to this physical distance. And remember, we don't have planes. We don't have, particularly fast ships. And so the time it took to travel from England to the colonies was months and months. And so, and we're pre-telephone, telegram, right? There's not ways to get messages to the colonies other than to have it travel by person via ship. And so there is this massive delay in getting news back and forth. And so it eventually leads to Britain just kind of saying, they're fine on their own, unless it comes down to receiving money. Then they want it, right? So you start to see Britain neglecting the colonies and not really helping them out in ways that they probably should. Navigation laws, where it says laws restricting colonial trade, that is something that's kind of described in this picture up here. So what that really comes down to is, you can see over here, we've got things like lumber in the north, iron in kind of the New England states, cotton and tobacco were things that were grown and exported down in the southern states, as well as things like sugar. But what you had happening was, because remember, the colonies are essentially subjects of England. England allowed the colonies to export raw goods or raw materials, right? The lumber, the iron, the cotton, the sugar, the tobacco. But they were required to export them to England, where England would take those raw materials and they would make finished products out of them. They would be the ones that were making furniture out of the lumber, tools out of the iron, clothing and textiles out of the cotton, cigarettes out of the tobacco, right? So, and then England would sell those goods and make a higher profit. In other words, they were getting the raw materials for cheap from the colonies. Colonists weren't getting much money back for them. England was taking that, making the finished product, selling that, and making a big profit, right? So England was coming out disproportionately on top when it came to making money off of these materials. So the colonists start to see this and say, well, why can't we export all of this material wherever we want? Why do we have to just give it to you so that you can take it, make it into something, turn around and sell it for more, right? That doesn't seem fair. That's essentially what you have happen. Okay? And on top of that, if you read the next thing down here, where it says mercantilism, unfair trade balance, and that is kind of what I was just talking about. Colonies were forced to provide raw material to Britain. And then not only was Great Britain selling those finished goods to other countries for a high price, Britain was selling the finished goods back to the colonists for a high price too. So the colonists were like getting it on both ends. They were getting cheated on the cost of the raw material, but then they were turning around and forced to buy stuff more expensively back from Great Britain. So you really start to see the colonists realize how unfair all this was, and they eventually came to the realization we can do all this on our own, and England is just taking money from us and limiting our potential. Okay. And then the last thing here is it says British forced the colonists to fight their war against France. You had this war going on between England and France, and the British were saying, well, Americans, you guys are essentially British, so we are going to require that you help us fight the French. The Americans were like, well, we don't even have any problem with the French. We're not a part of this war. We've been living over here 4,000 miles away, doing our own thing, and you're telling us we have to fight this war for you. So all of those things kind of added together led to essentially America deciding enough is enough, we're going to become our own country. Okay? So here are just some of the notable events of the American Revolution. Again, none of these are things that you need to memorize, but you had kind of British action on one side, and then you had kind of a colonial reaction. And it just kind of went back and forth and back. Okay, so, and most of these deal with some kind of tax in some way or shape, right? So you have the Sugar Act, which British said we're going to put a tax on sugar and on liquor. You had the Stamp Act, which was the British saying we're going to tax paper products. You had the Quartering Act, which forced colonists to provide housing for British soldiers, which, if we remember talking about civics and government, the Third Amendment to the Constitution is no quartering of soldiers. Well, obviously, the Americans, when they started their own country, said that's not something that we're going to allow. We're not going to allow soldiers to just come into your house and say, feed and house. And so on and so forth. You kind of see the various taxes that the British continued to put on colonial exports. And on the other side of this, you have stuff like the Boston Massacre, which was a revolt against the presence of British soldiers, and the whole Quartering Act, right, where you had British soldiers forcing colonists to house them. You had the Boston Massacre was a revolt against that. And then you had the Boston Tea Party, which the colonists snuck on board these ships and dumped all this tea into the bay outside of Boston in protest of taxation on tea. And so you kind of had Britain heaping on these taxes, the colonists rebelling against them and protesting, and then in response to that, Britain just keeps putting on more taxes, more protests, and it just builds until finally enough is enough, right? And so eventually you get to America writing and signing the Declaration of Independence, sending it off to Great Britain and saying, we are no longer considered part of your country. We're going to be our own country. And fight us for it if you want. That's what happened. So you essentially have this war in the 13 colonies that's fought between Great Britain and the American colonists. So not going to go through all these specific battles. That's not something that we need to worry about or remember. Okay. Lexington and Concord. I'm just going to kind of mention these main ones here, these main three. Then if you do have any questions about any of this stuff, I can always go into more detail another time. But Lexington and Concord is the very first battle, and that was April 19th, 1775. 1777 at Saratoga, you have colonial success. So when this first started, this is like a David versus Goliath thing, right? Where you have the American colonists, who are these kind of ragtag group of dirtbags, essentially, versus the most powerful country in the world, the most powerful naval fleet and army and all of this stuff, right? And so it started to feel like, or at the beginning, it felt like this kind of hopeless thing. But as the war waged on, you start to see the colonists actually succeed. And so 1777, there was enough of this success to where it encouraged the French to actually join the colonists and help them beat Great Britain. Okay? And that was a big turning point in the war. Because then you had this older, more established country with more resources and more goods that could help the colonists fight and defeat Great Britain. Yorktown was the final battle, where the colonists were victorious, and that was 1781. And Yorktown, let me check on my, gotta check my skills here. Fancy, maybe I shouldn't have checked my skills. This map here is pretty, Yorktown is right here. And that was the final battle of the war. So if you kind of look over here, you can see all of these different things. And when we're talking about maps, like yesterday when we did some practice questions, we talked about reading maps, right? So this is kind of a crazy map to look at, but you've got the little stars or whatever you want to call them. The red ones are American victories, the blue ones are British victories, and then you kind of have some battles that were indistinguishable between one and the other. Right? And that's the purple. But then you also have the red is American troop movements and kind of the routes they took, the British troop movements, and then also the French. Okay, so again, 1781, right here, Yorktown, Virginia, is the final battle, and by 1783, there was a treaty that was signed by representatives of Great Britain and the United States, and that officially ended the war and really started America as functioning as its own country from then on. Even though the Declaration of Independence was signed much earlier, the American Revolution wasn't decided until 1783. Okay? So again, you don't need to know all these specific things. I just kind of want to run through it so you have a general idea. And if you can remember who we rebelled against, right, roughly when it was that we won, then you're ahead of a lot of students I've met. You're doing all right. Okay, so with that, let's see. Yeah, I guess, and then I'll go over this slide briefly. I'm not going to go into detail about the Constitution and all of that because we talked about that at length a couple weeks ago. But essentially, while this is happening, so if you take a look at these dates here, remember, the American Revolution wasn't decided until 1781 and really wasn't signed officially until 1783. So all of this stuff is happening while we're at war. So you have 1774 as the first Continental Congress, where you have a group of people getting together. They send the king a declaration of their grievances or their complaints, basically, and they plan their resistance or they plan their rebellion if the king doesn't give what they want. Right? 1775 is the Olive Branch Petition, and that was a kind of last plea for peace. It was basically the Americans saying, we want to be our own country. We can do this peaceably if you just agree to this. But the king rejected it and declared that the colonies were in a state of rebellion. 1776 is when you have the Second Continental Congress, and that's where we have the Declaration of Independence written and signed by all of the delegates. July 4th, 1776. Articles of Confederation, which if you were in class with us last week or the week before, when we talked about this, Articles of Confederation were our first constitution that we drafted. And that was 1777, but it didn't last very long, and we've talked about the reasons why it failed, but it essentially was our first attempt at setting up and running a government, but the country was going bankrupt and it was losing money for various reasons. And in 1787, we had the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia where we actually drafted the U.S. Constitution as it exists today, and it's been in place ever since. So that's kind of just a brief timeline of kind of the political side of it that was going on alongside the war, right? So I want to stop there in terms of the new material. Tomorrow we will pick up here at Westward Expansion, but I want to just do a couple practice questions. It looks like we've got time for that. So let me share my screen and pull up the same sheet of questions that we had yesterday, but yesterday we just did numbers 1 and 2. So today I want to do these last 3 questions. So again, you can always feel free to answer them in the chat if you like, or you can kind of answer them to yourself. That's fine as well. So number 3 here says some of the early colonists did not come to the New World to gain power and wealth. These groups came seeking freedom from persecution. Which immigrant group is most similar to those early colonists? So remember, when we talked about the religious groups, those were people that were not concerned with money and power. They came to the New World just to have freedom to do what they wanted in terms of practicing their religion. Okay? So which of these immigrant groups, and there are groups that we are talking about like in present day. So we have to kind of read through these options and see which one matches those early colonists that came to the New World just for freedom and freedom from being persecuted against. So we have A, African slaves who were involuntarily brought to work on plantations. B, Mexican workers who came to the U.S. to earn better wages than they could at home. C, British businessmen who visited the U.S. to invest in media companies. Or D, Haitian refugees who fled to the U.S. to escape. So again, we're looking for which immigrant group is most similar to those. So again, if this was me, a couple stand out that I would for sure get rid of. A, African slaves who were involuntarily brought to work on plantations. African slaves don't match this at all because the people coming seeking freedom from persecution had a choice in the matter, right? And were seeking freedom. African slaves were taken and brought to America involuntarily. Okay, so A is the first one I'd throw out. I'd probably also throw out C, British businessmen who visited the U.S. to invest in media companies. Okay? First of all, it says visited, which means maybe they're not living in the United States, so they didn't really immigrate. And then it doesn't really, there's nothing in here about being persecuted against or basically their lives being endangered, right? Or threatened. Okay? There's nothing in C that mentions anything like that. So I'd look at B and I'd look at D. Mexican workers who came to the U.S. to earn better wages than they could at home. Or D, Haitian refugees who fled to the U.S. to escape a dictatorship. Okay? So one of these deals with money and wealth and power. One of these deals with persecution. Right? B, Mexican workers who came to the U.S. to earn better wages. That is a money driven. Right? So the right answer here ends up being D, Haitian refugees who fled to the U.S. to escape a dictatorship. That's the most similar comparison to the group that they were talking about. All right, let's look at, yeah, these are pretty easy and pretty quick. So let's go through them quickly here before we follow. So number 4. Number 4 says, according to the information on page 430, and that's just the page above it, but don't worry about it because this is stuff we talked about anyway, so you don't really need to have the information on the page. Which of the following was a cause of the American Revolution? Remember, if we're talking about cause and effect, cause is something that led to it happening. So which of these led to the American Revolution taking place? A, France's defeat in the French and Indian War. B, increased British taxes and restrictions on the colonies. C, Britain's acquisition of France's colonies in North America. Or D, the publication of the Declaration of Independence. Only one of these things actually led to the American Revolution or was a direct cause, right? And we talked about it. It is increased taxes, right? So B, increased British taxes and restrictions on the colonies. And then real quickly, since we are just about out of time, let's go ahead and do number 5. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution states, Congress shall make no law abridging the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievance. Now, we don't talk like that today, and so that's kind of confusing. Think about the First Amendment. Freedom of speech. That's essentially what we're talking about. But we're also talking about the freedom of assembly, peacefully assemble, and to petition, right? So the right to petition the government, as long as it's done peacefully. Okay? So that was the first thing when we drafted our Constitution. That was the number one most important thing that the people at the time cared about. Okay? Why is it most likely that the framers of the Constitution included these guarantees? That's the question we're asking. Okay? Why was that the one thing we cared about most when we created our government? A, they were planning to organize assemblies. B, they were concerned about the government becoming tyrannical. C, they were hoping to petition the government. Or D, they were attempting to prevent a redress in grievance. Okay? So for the sake of time, I'm going to go through this quicker than I normally would, but A and C would be the first ones I'd get rid of. They were planning to organize assemblies. They weren't planning to have assemblies. They were just saying they wanted to be able to make sure they were allowed to happen if they did, right? And same thing here. They weren't hoping people would petition the government. They were the government. They were creating the government. But they wanted people to have the right to do it. So it wasn't that they were hoping that these things would happen. It's that in the event they did happen, they wanted to make sure that they were allowed to happen. Okay? And so that's different. So that's why I would get rid of A and C right away. B and D, they were concerned about the government becoming tyrannical, or D, they were attempting to prevent a redress of grievance. Okay? So without really going into detail about what D is talking about, look at B and tell me if it doesn't answer the question. The biggest thing they were concerned about was making sure that the government didn't have too much power and didn't abuse that power, which matches B, right? Because they had just come from being subjects of the King of England, who was tyrannical, who did have too much power. And so the reason the First Amendment exists, and the reason it's the first and the kind of most important, is because they absolutely didn't want to go through what they had gone through with England. So they were concerned that the government would become too powerful. So B is your answer for number 5. All right, so with that, let's stop there for the day. I will be back with science class if any of you want to join at 1:15. Martin's got his usual reading class at 12:15. Otherwise, I'll see you back for more social studies tomorrow. Hopefully that was helpful, and I will talk to you all later. Have a good day.